music helped me to feel very close to who I am and to my family and to my origins. And when I was a teenager, when I was 19, in fact, my mother passed away. And along with that time period, I had a lot of Chinese elders in my family who also had passed away. And being half Chinese and being fifth generation Chinese Canadian, I really had this sense of like, who am I? I think it's a question that a lot of people ask at that age when you're in your teens and your early 20s. And also, how can I connect to my identity and my ancestry as I'm, so far down the line, removed from these Chinese roots and that feeling of loss? How can I stay in connection with this identity or perhaps reconnect?
On the Rise, behind the lyrics, beyond the music. Hello, everybody. This is On the Rise, behind the lyrics, beyond the music. This particular podcast is dedicated to exploring incredible, emerging, and established artists in the music industry who share a passion for making meaningful art, a connection with Asian heritage, and a role in shaping our communities. Today, we get to dive into the music of Holly Keen Goldies, who performs as Senyuè. Hear about their creative process in writing songs, the story behind one specific song, and ideas about what's next. Hello, Holly. Hello, Senyuè.
Hi, Gina. Thank you so much for having me here. What an honor.
I'm so happy that you're here. I'm so excited. We chatted just a little bit earlier before this went live. And sincerely, I'm so happy that we get a chance to chat about your music and all that you're doing. And so, Holly, I know that you go by a different name, an artist name, and I'd love for you to introduce yourself to our audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Holly, and my artist name is Senyuè. It's a name that is derived from a Mandarin name that I had given myself when I first began studying Mandarin in 2006, 2007 at university. And it means small hill moon. And I often say mountain moon as my name. And it comes from a deep connection that I have to nature, as well as a time when I was traveling and backpacking in China in 2007 and 8, and just trying to find out who I was and what was going on in the world. I was pretty young at that time, 20 years old. So that's a little bit about where my name comes from. And, I'm also of Chinese Canadian background. That trip in China to rediscover my roots really influenced me in my journey with music and who I am. And so that's why I go by Senyuè. And yeah, I also can share that I identify as non-binary. And so I use they pronouns, and can also share that I'm half Chinese, a fifth generation Chinese Canadian settler here in the lands colonially known as Canada. And I'm also quarter Scottish and quarter Ukrainian in my identity. And kind of through this interview, you'll see a lot of my work has to do with identity as well.
That sounds so rich in so many cultures, rich in so many ways. And I think you're right. We are all going to get a sense of how that comes out through the things that you write, the things that you think about, how you process. So that's really exciting. Thanks so much for giving us all that introduction.
Thank you.
So there's so much to talk about. And I think one thing that I'm really curious about is, so you work with a couple of hats. You do storytelling, you write folk songs, you do research. I want to ask, what did your journey look like to get you to this point of being an artist?
That really makes me think about when I was 5 years old and I was standing in my backyard making up songs and dreaming about being an opera singer. I came from a family where my mother was a music teacher, and she also had founded a chamber choir. And so I spent my childhood listening to her choir and singing in choir as well, learning the piano. And that had a great influence on my life to be close to music. And the journey to get to where I am today began then with my childhood and that early connection to music. And at a certain point, I wanted to kind of move away from the more classical realm of music. It's also that music helps me to feel very close to who I am and to my family and to my origins. And when I was a teenager, when I was 19, in fact, my mother passed away. And along with that time period, I had a lot of Chinese elders in my family who also had passed away. And being half Chinese and being fifth generation Chinese Canadian, I really had this sense of like, who am I? I think it's a question that a lot of people ask at that age when you're in your teens and your early 20s. And also, how can I connect to my identity and my ancestry as I'm, so far down the line, removed from these Chinese roots and that feeling of loss? How can I stay in connection with this identity? Or perhaps reconnect. And so I think that, a big part of that was, like I mentioned, going to China, trying to figure out what is a deepening of this culture and how can I heal from this grief. So a big part of my journey was that sense of searching for identity and connection. I think that really ties into my work and where it's led me. Another element as well is that when I first began writing my music in the last few years, it was during the pandemic, actually. And it was a time where I was living in Vancouver. I saw a rise in anti-Asian sentiment, in violence towards people of Asian descent. I think that combination and culmination of people also maybe asking, well, where are you from? And knowing that I'm fifth generation Canadian, or knowing that that's a question that can really make someone feel like they don't belong. I think that really drove me to really continue working on my album and to perhaps accelerate my work to become an artist and to get my name, Senyuè, and to get my music out here. It felt like, okay, not only have I been for many years discovering my own identity and connection to ancestry and healing from grief, but now there's that push to go a little further with my connection to identity and music and creation, and really put myself out there to get my music out and messages, historical messages of identity and contributions to this nation that have been given by people of Asian descent. So yeah, that definitely has been a part of this journey and furthering this work.
Well, that's incredible, because when I hear that you speak of being fifth generation Canadian, emotions that you've experienced are, I don't want to say surprising, but one of my questions that comes up is, as a fifth generation Canadian, do you still feel like this need for searching deeper and beyond your Canadian roots into your Asian roots? Absolutely. That's part of where you come from. So whether you're first generation, an immigrant, second generation, fifth generation, seventh generation, there is definitely this sense of wanting to discover where you've come from, where your family roots have come from.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And part of my identity as well is that I work as an expressive arts therapist. And so I think that I'm very interested in the themes of going inwards, no matter who we are, and really searching what can help us to understand more about ourselves, so that, when we are with one another in community, that we can really have an understanding. Where do I come from? And where do my neighbors come from? What are their identities and their cultural heritages and their, sexual or gender identities? And how can we continue to see one another as people, knowing that we all have these different backgrounds? So it really feels important as well to community development, this work with music and identity and creation and sharing.
What a compliment in terms of the ability for you to dive into people's emotions, and the fact that you actually facilitate these sorts of interactions with people so that they can learn more about themselves. I feel that your music must be able to draw from so many perspectives, your own, yes, but also through your relationships and through your clients and through your experiences. I'm sure you're able to think so much more empathetically and compassionately about what other people are experiencing, and to put that out through lyrics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that just this whole journey, it all ties into all of these different identities. So being a community member, being a therapist, being a creative and a performer. And I've really enjoyed the overlap of this work and how it really can entwine, so I'll be facilitating a workshop and can bring in music to share on that theme, or being on stage and performing and offer grounding as part of the performance. So it's been really interesting to bring these different identities together and move them forward in this journey of creation, facilitation, and performance.
Right. And when you said the word grounding, this is a word that is a little bit new even to myself. So just for our listeners, essentially, what do you mean by grounding?
So sometimes, maybe we can be feeling a little bit anxious or a little bit stressed, or perhaps we feel an overwhelming emotion like anger or upset. And grounding is something that involves our body and our breath and our central nervous system. So it's a way that we can find to come back. And oftentimes it can mean connecting our feet to the earth, working with our central nervous system through breathing exercises. Singing or music can really help with that as well, to calm, or a little bit of movement can be helpful. There's many ways, and connecting to nature can be another grounding activity. So it's something that I actually write into some of my music. And for the most part, a lot of my music has a slower pace to it. Some of my music talks about breathing and breath, a lot of symbolism with nature. And so I think that really influences my songwriting.
I'm getting the sense that your live music performances is such an experience, music that you can take in and enjoy, but it's something that's very therapeutic, something that will allow the listeners to tap into feelings that they've got inside and give them the space to process that even while they're listening to you.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a part of it. And also, I think that it's something that I've built into the experience, because some of the topics that I address in my music can be activating for people. So it can bring up bigger emotions. And so in some ways, it's a way of offering care to myself as I'm performing, and also to others as listeners, because I do talk about race in my music. I do talk about racism and, gender identity, and just the history of Canadian legislation towards folks of different backgrounds can be a little bit activating, or triggering would be another word. And so it definitely is something that I think about, not to shy away from delving into hard themes. And also, what is the balance of providing care and sharing a truth?
Mm-hmm. Senyuè, what I am, getting from this conversation and this part of the conversation is this very intricate way where you balance not only the need to express your feelings, your thoughts, your questions, but also this messaging that you want to share with others so that everybody can come along and grow together. And I'm so impressed with this ability for you to hold both, so that through your music, you're caring for yourself, but also you're able to care for others along the way. That's really exciting. I really want to jump into your songwriting process. You've spoken a little bit about your search and your travels and your questions and your inspiration and your messages. And if you wanted to boil it down, how would you describe your songwriting process in one example from conception to completion? And I know that little bit later on, we're going to hear one of your songs called Music Carry Me Home. And Senyuè, it's absolutely beautiful. I had listened to it earlier, and it was just so much of what you had said. It was calming. It made me feel like how you're describing this grounding sense. And I'm really excited to learn about how you wrote that. What was the process from conception to where it's at now?
Absolutely. So what I do find is that each song is quite different in how they are created. Some songs will just come in one go in the moment, and I'll write them in, quite a short amount of time. I could be even driving and hit record on my phone or at home and something comes to me and I feel the energy and boom, right there's the whole song. And that wasn't the case with Music Carry Me Home. Music Carry Me Home was a longer process for songwriting. And in fact, it was a combination of two songs. First of all, Music Carry Me Home used to be a song that was about 3 minutes long or 3.5 minutes long. And when you hear the song, there's a musical element to the song that's entwined then with spoken word. So those two elements of the song were actually separate in the beginning. And I first began writing a lot of this music in September of 2021. And I had my first performance of a larger body of the work in December of 2021. During that performance, I really had kind of a theater forward type of performance. I was using costumes and a lot of movement and dance and experimental music. And this song, it was presented as a monologue for the spoken word element. And I put on a top hat and I read some quotes, some racist quotes from John A. Macdonald, Canada's first prime minister. And I also read facts about Canadian legislation and read a little bit about how that impacted folks, and this is in the late 1800s, 1885 or so. And then I had a separate song that was called Music Carry Me Home that I had written about my grandmother and her personal experience growing up with the influence of this legislation that was put into place. And, she grew up in Victoria's Chinatown. So the songwriting process for that really involved, first of all, I usually need a pretty quiet and clear space. So I make sure that my house is clean so that I can just really focus on the songwriting. And in that beginning time period of songwriting, I also needed no one else to be home. So my partner was not home and I had the entire day to do songwriting. I went out onto the back porch, and that's where I wrote this song for my grandmother. The monologue section I had also worked on, and that was less of an emotional writing and rather more based on research originally. And then eventually I performed it as the two separate pieces. And this was during a quiet sit-down performance where I had control of the whole audience space in terms of, you come in, you sit down and you listen to the whole show. But then I was invited to perform in more of a bar setting. So allowed, people might have drinks and are chatting and it's not a focused, dedicated audience space. And so I thought, how can I get across this message, which is historical, going back hundreds of years, to a louder crowd who are less focused on the messaging and the show and more maybe focused on wanting to have a good time. Maybe people have had a few drinks. And I thought, how can I make this song accessible without it needing to be a sit-down theater type of performance? So that's where I had the idea to rewrite the song and to bring in these historical elements and this monologue and to intertwine it with that personal story of my grandmother. And so that's what I did. I rewrote it. And I was very nervous to perform it the first time because it meant that the song was about 12 minutes long. So you'll see it's quite a long song. But I was fascinated during the performance to see that of all the songs that I performed that night, louder songs or more rock songs or more dance songs, this was the song that hushed the entire crowd in that rowdy room. And you could hear a pin drop. If you dropped a pin, it was just absolutely silent. And it was a very moving experience to see that people wanted to hear the history of Chinese Canadian contributing and of this racist legislation by the Canadian government, entwined with the personal. So it was, very moving. And I decided from then on that the song would remain intact like that. And I just continued making a few edits here and there to the spoken word process to bring in some other personal elements, this legislation came through, and thinking about how did that influence my family and how did that influence the Chinese Canadian diaspora across hundreds of years. So trying to bring more of that personal element into the monologue element as well.
Mm-hmm. And do you find that with the monologue element, depending on who's in your audience, in the live performance, you can modify that according to where you're feeling at that particular point, where you feel your audience is connecting to you at that particular point?
There's some songs where I do that, but not with this one. This one, I really do leave it as it is and allow for it to unfold. And I felt a repeat of that connection to the song across no matter what identities or backgrounds people have in the audience. I often have people audience members coming up after and either saying, I knew this history, I'm Chinese Canadian and I knew this history, but thank you for sharing again, and it felt good to be in the space and to hear it and to feel it with you. Or I'll have some other folks come up and say, perhaps with a different cultural background, and say, I had no idea. Or folks who have immigrated to Canada more recently and didn't learn about this history and said, I had no idea. I learned a lot during that performance, so thank you. So it's been really interesting to hear the feedback of folks who have heard this song as well.
That's so beautiful. So for people who are listening, this particular podcast is called On the Rise, and this season is really looking at the lyrics, behind the lyrics, and beyond the music. So behind the lyrics, beyond the music. And Senyuè, we're going to let our listeners listen to a clip of this song, Music Carry Me Home.
There's a story in my blood, music in my bones. When I feel lost, unknown, music carry me home. Music carry me home. You were born in Victoria's Chinatown, third in a line of 8. You took care of the younger ones, made sure they all went to school. You had a good sense of humor. You were pretty smart, twirled a baton in the Chinese drill team, and people called you sharp. Your piano teacher noticed you had talent, so your family saved up. And wasn't it this music that was your saving grace, that helped you hold your chin up? You could play that music, but you couldn't swim. You could play that music, but you couldn't swim because the color of your skin. You could play that music, but you couldn't swim. You could play that music, but you couldn't swim because the color of your skin. Oh, Canada. Oh, Canada. Open your borders when you need us, but you don't really see us. Open your borders when you need us, but you don't really see us. In 1871, the colony of British Columbia agreed to join the Dominion of Canada, but only if connected transported by rail. The section of the CPR rail that ran from Vancouver through the Fraser Canyon was the most treacherous to build, and the jobs were hard to fill. But the track, it needed to be laid, and the country, it needed to be united. And so the Canadian government brought in 17,000 Chinese workers. When the railroad was finished being built, a photo was taken to commemorate this moment. It was a moment of celebration, of completion, of connection. It was the union of a nation. But before they could have taken this photo, they would have had to have cleared out all of those Chinese workers, cleared out all traces of their histories, of their stories, cleared out all traces of their voice. You see, there is not a single Chinese worker in this photo. When the railroad was finished being built, it was that same year that the Chinese head tax was introduced. At first, it was $50, and then it was $100. Finally, it was $500. This tax separated families, made it difficult to reunite. It left wives living lives alone in China. Men here in Canada doing the same. Many Chinese men never married. Many new voices were never born. In 1923, the same year that my grandmother was born and for whom I have written this song, to celebrate Canada's birth. On July 1st, Canada Day, the Chinese Exclusion Act was introduced. Barring any Chinese immigration to Canada between the years of 1923 to 1947, the same years that my grandparents were born and later married, born in Canada but not considered Canadian citizens, born in Canada but could not vote. Born in Canada, but could not see a film unless sitting in the back row with First Nations, other Asians, or POC. Born in Canada, but could not swim. There's a story in my blood, music in my bones. When I feel lost and known, music carry me home. Music carry me home. Music carry me home.
So, Senyuè, thank you so much. That music was great and just lovely to listen to. And I want to switch gears a little bit and go back to your cultural identity. And we've talked a little bit about your roots and your search for it. I want to ask if there was a time in your journey as an artist where you feel like your cultural identity was really celebrated. Because I know that there are a lot of pain points that music, and particularly your music, can be used to explore. And looking at the other side, have you felt like there's been a time in your artistic journey where you feel like your Asian Canadian heritage has really been celebrated and you've felt that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I definitely have been invited to perform in a lot of different settings at this point that do celebrate and honor cultural identity in general, or specifically Asian heritage. Some examples: I played a show on June 10th in Cumberland, BC, which is on the unceded traditional territories of the Comox Nation. During this celebration, it was the 125th anniversary of the village, but instead of calling the celebration, Happy Birthday Cumberland or something like that, the village organizers decided to put on a celebration called Belonging. And they invited me to play on the main stage. So I had a 45-minute set. And I think that with the intention of that celebration, which is belonging in community and really trying to come from a decolonized lens as well, it felt really good to be invited to play on that stage and to be a big part of this celebration. And as well, there was a large Chinese settlement in this village. It was a mining village in the 1800s. On that same day, the Cumberland Museum here had a visiting exhibition called A Seat at the Table, and they opened that exhibition on the same day as the celebration. And the title, A Seat at the Table, really recognizing that Chinese Canadians contributed to the development of Canada and the nation, albeit a history of colonization, but they contributed and never really had that recognition. So it felt really nice to be a part of a celebration that was so focused on reclaiming space, reclaiming that pride of identity, and not forgetting the historical contributions made locally here, in this village, but also across the nation. And that's really a similar message for my music, a big theme, a theme of, belonging, identity, and history and pride. And so, yeah, that felt really, really beautiful. There were different events. There was lantern making as a community event, and the community made 5,000 dumplings to serve. And, now that I think of it, there's 5,000 people that live here. So that was really beautiful.
I love that you shared this story about how your cultural identity was recognized. And when I say your cultural identity, I also mean my cultural identity. And I also mean the cultural identity of so many others. And just kind of circling back to earlier things that you said in this podcast, where you mentioned how this particular music attracts all sorts of people from different backgrounds. So whether it's from Asian heritage or a different background, and the fact is that one thing we share in common is that we all belong here right now. I was reflecting on a thought the other day, thinking about how sometimes the best memories are made through adversity. When you are put together on a particular project or in a particular setting and things are hard, it might be a new job, it might be, you're away for, a weekend retreat or whatnot, and you've got to work through things together. And that particular group bonds very deeply. And I feel that on a small scale, it's exciting when you can build that community and be seen and to see others and to grow as a person. And I was also thinking on a larger scale, my goodness, right now we're here with whomever happens to be living in the world at this particular point, and whoever happens to be in the music industry or in whatever other professional aspects or personal aspects that like how we live our lives. These are the people that we're walking with at this moment. So if I'm going through life and I'm hurting, or if I'm succeeding, or I'm celebrating, if I'm happy, if I'm sad, this is the community that we get to live with for our lifetimes. And I just felt like that was really profound for myself. And it made me really want to embrace where I'm at and the people that I'm surrounded by, and also to accept some of the hardships that come my way and some of the exciting moments, as well as some of those struggles, or even some of those mistakes that we make. That's exactly how we deepen our relationships with each other. So we kind of push through the mistakes. We're not just looking at each other and saying, you know what, this didn't measure up to my expectations, but rather we're saying, you know what, I'm here for the first time. This is my first time living. And it's the first time living. So let's be kind to each other, and let's just know that everybody is trying to work it out. Anyhow, when you were telling that story, it reminded me of that thought that I had. So really exciting, and that celebration of belonging just sounds amazing. I want to talk about like looking forward into your career as a performer. And I know you do other things, like you mentioned that arts therapy. I know that you're also a producer, and you do some research. So looking forward in, let's say, the next 3-5 years, what do you see? What do you see in terms of your music specifically? Where is this going?
Well, I have a few different directions that I see my projects moving forward. I wanted to bring up the idea of collaboration, which has been feeling really exciting for me. So I think, I mentioned we're actually due to give birth in 5 days. And so on June 25th, we have our little one is due. And so I will be, taking a bit of a step back from performing as much in the short term. But in the long term, I'm really thinking about collaboration and how to move this project forward, how to reach more people, different audiences, and also communities. So one person that I was really intrigued to meet and to hear his music, his name is Jeremy Paul, and he performs as Saltwater Hank. And I first heard him play in a house show here in Cumberland. And I was really impressed because he was playing this beautiful bluegrass music, which is kind of an offset of folk music. And a lot of my music is folk music or singer-songwriter. But he was also performing in his First Nations language. So he was on this journey to rediscover his language, which had been wiped away due to colonization and, residency schools. And he lives in Prince George, but has just released an album in late May, in his language, so of the Tsimshian First Nations, and in Simaliak language. And so he had worked with an elder to record an album, a 9-song album in that language. And I had kind of reached out to him when I first met him, and I said, I don't know what it is, but I would love to collaborate with you sometime in the future. And he kind of said, what could that look like? I was like, oh, maybe we could write a song together, or maybe we could play a show together, because I'm also working to rediscover my Asian heritage and bringing some songs that include that language and that theme. And so we've been in touch since then. That was a few years ago. And that ties into another dream that I have, which is to go on tour. And knowing that he lives in northern BC, my dream is to go on my first tour, because I haven't done that yet. I've played here in Cumberland and locally in Comox, and I've played in Vancouver, but I haven't gone on tour. So I have a dream of buying a van and loading into the van with our new baby and our dog, and with my partner, and taking the ferry from the northern point of Vancouver Island and going to play in Haida Gwaii, and playing a show with Jeremy in Prince Rupert, and playing music festivals next summer in northern BC, and just winding my way through this province to share these messages, because I know myself, having grown up in a small BC community here on Vancouver Island, just half hour from where I am now in Campbell River, I know that some of the difficulties are lack of diversity and lack of conversation about cultural identity. And so my real dream is to go on tour and, to share this music, and perhaps to host workshops where there can be dialogue with local people around these themes. So that's a major dream for me for next summer. I also met someone named Kat who performs as Cougar Annie. So she's written a one-person play, and I'd met her last September. We were both playing the same music festival, and both of us have written music and kind of theater-leaning music about the gold rush period, about history. And I bumped into her a few weekends ago at a performance in Cumberland, and we said hi, and she had mentioned collaboration as well, in that perhaps we could bring our two stories together. Cougar Annie is a white settler on the west coast of Vancouver Island. My stories have to do with Chinese Canadian settlers from a similar time period of the mid to late 1800s. And how could we perhaps create a theater piece together that we could tour with as well? So those are just some of my ideas for the future, and a way to take this work both further in terms of geography, and to deepen in terms of sharing with other communities, and also to deepen the ways in which these messages are shared, in that I could bring a more theater forward type of performance as well.
That's really interesting. Also, because the audience is changing. And so, as you mentioned, sometimes you're playing in intimate venues, and sometimes you're being invited to large bars or louder bars. And sometimes you're just going to be on an open stage in the middle of a music forest, in the middle of a music festival, in the middle of a forest or whatnot. And yeah, just being able to be creative about how you're presenting the music and the stories that you want to tell in such a medium that makes it more accessible to everybody is really great. And I love this fact that you're looking at all these ways to collaborate with people who are in theater, people who are doing music, people who are doing similar themes, people whose themes are from a different perspective, but kind of have this underlying foundation. I'm really excited to continue following you and seeing where that goes. And so, Holly, I guess my last question is, where can we learn more about you? Where can we find you? Where can we listen to you? Tell us how.
Well, just in April, I had a pre-album release party. Because we have our child on the way, I didn't think that I would have the capacity to host an album release show with a newborn. And so I did a pre-album release performance in April. The whole show can be found I have an Instagram platform, so it's senyuè.artist, and that's how you can find me on Instagram and Facebook. And the album release show, people can get a link to that performance through buying a piece of merch. So I've written a short book to go along with the stories, to tell a little bit more, a deepening of the history, which during the show I was a little out of breath because I was 7 months pregnant. So I have the book as well that continues to deepen those stories. And in the fall or winter, the whole album will be released and that will be on all streaming platforms. I also have a YouTube, which is Senyuè Artist, or Senyuè. You can find me there. I also have a website, which is senyueartist.com. But yeah, so there's a lot of ways to find me, and I'd love to be in touch. Instagram is probably my most active social media space.
Perfect. Thank you so much for listening to On the Rise, Behind the Lyrics, Beyond the Music. Today we had the chance to listen to Holly Keen Goldies, who performs as Senyuè. Senyuè is a queer Chinese-Canadian performer, producer, facilitator, and expressive arts therapist who has lived both in China and in Canada and currently resides on the unceded traditional territories of the Comox Nation, colonially known as Cumberland, BC. Their musical work surrounds their Chinese-Canadian family legacy, ancestors, history, and queer identity, as well as speaking hard truths about racism in Canada. And this has been an incredible interview. Thank you so much for being with us, Holly. And I'm excited for the production of this particular podcast and to hear more about where you're going.
Thank you so much, Gina, for having me. It's been a true honor to be here. And I look forward to keeping in touch with you as well in your musical journey. And thank you so much again for bringing me in. It's been a real honor to be here.